Okay,
All right.
going live.
Ian, I don't see it yet, so maybe you need to give a few more minutes to catch up. I
Okay,
don't
I'm
see
seeing it on
the
my end.
on the YouTube side. Do you have both places go live clicked on YouTube
I
as
see
well
it
as
as well, Shri.
Oh, okay. All right.
All right. Well, welcome everyone to the Technical Advisory Committee for NVTA on November 16th, 2022. We have an agenda today that has my name plastered all over it. So hopefully this will be a somewhat straightforward meeting. We have the summary notes of October 19th, 2022 meeting. Do we have a motion to approve?
Motion to approve.
I see Armand seconded and Frank, I think, was about to. Anybody opposed to accepting those meeting minutes? Hearing none, those meeting minutes are approved. So now we're moving into the transaction update. Thank you for sharing the screen. We have the transaction plan was submitted to us for review, and trusting that we had people review it. And now is an open discussion before I take a motion to any kind of motion that we want to take on this transaction plan. So I open it to the committee.
Chair Boyce.
Yes, sir.
If I may, not in your packet, we do have a brief presentation which.
Fine. Let's go through that, Mr. Jasper.
Okay. Ian, could you load the presentation? Okay, so thanks. We didn't send this with you. It's really the intent here is just to step you through some things that you may already have heard before and what we've done. So I'll be as quick as possible. If you go to the next slide, Ian. So just a quick recap on feedback from the committees, updates, enhancements that we've made to the plan, and then we'll get to the endorsement after that. This presentation does include transaction overview and summary of public comments if needed, but I do not propose to talk to those. And also I would note that there are some references to page numbers in this presentation, and these page numbers are the ones shown in the bottom left-hand corner of the document, as opposed to the PDF page number, since we do have a couple of pages at the beginning with Roman numerals, which confuses things. So that's what I'm referring to as page number. Next slide, please, Ian. You can go one more. So the PCAC, like yourselves, met in September and October, and we've dealt with various comments, and we provided responses to those comments as shown on your screen. And I'm not going to read through them all, but I just note a few of them here. In particular, the second bullet refers to 54% reduction in emission that was shown on one of the charts that we used, which caused a little bit of concern because we weren't sufficiently clear on the assumptions that would be needed to be fulfilled in order to achieve that 54% reduction. The number that was calculated was accurate, but it did assume a lot of things would have to happen to give us that kind of best case outcome. And based on feedback, we decided to take that 54% bar out of a chart and reword this section to kind of address the fact that the NVTA doesn't have a great deal of control over the penetration rate of EV and subsequent emissions reduction potential that comes from that. So we're kind of showing, previously we showed like a best case and a worst case scenario. Now we're just showing the worst case scenario, recognizing that the reality will probably be somewhere in between, depending on consumer preferences and what the auto manufacturers do and so on. Next slide, please. The PCAC's meeting in October, there were a few additional comments. Just note the one at the bottom here that transaction is not a land use plan. The comment was kind of expressing concern about some projects potentially becoming obsolete, and we share the concern about not wanting to invest in projects that could become obsolete before they've met their useful life, which is why we do the scenario analysis, is to kind of investigate that uncertainty and long-range planning. But that said, transaction does not control land use decisions. That's the purview of the local jurisdictions, and the plan itself is not a land use plan. Where we have committed is to monitor emerging trends, to try our best to detect as early as possible any trends that might potentially lead to a pathway of investment obsolescence. And another aspect here is that we do update the plan every 5 years. So, since most trends that occur aren't overnight changes in any given 5-year cycle, we should be on reasonably safe ground, but we do need to constantly revisit this, particularly as we come to our 6-year program and funding recommendations. Next slide. So your meeting in September, a number of comments. You may recall that you were pretty early in the process at this point, so we realized you hadn't had necessarily enough time to kind of come up with too many questions, but I think for the most part, what you did come up with, we addressed, and there were more in October on the next slide, which we've taken on board to the extent we can. So the first bullet about focusing on findings and assumptions as opposed to mechanics is something we wholeheartedly agree with, we wanted to make sure that when it came to the scenarios, we focused on what the results meant, as opposed to how we actually came up with them. In the third bullet, an example of the level of granularity that transaction will not typically get into. So there were some comments about showing what the number or the location of charging stations and kilowatt hours would be per station. To some extent, NVTA control that with its funding leveraging, but again, it's a level of detail that we don't really get into with the projects that are in transaction and the performance of those projects. The incentives pricing scenario, there was some question about how this might actually come to be, but as we've noted throughout with the scenarios, while they're all considered plausible, they're not predicted or preferred, and so again, we can't really begin to predict the likelihood of any one scenario occurring. We just don't get into that level of detail. I'm not even sure it's possible that anyone could reliably predict the likelihood of any particular scenario happening, because almost by definition, they are very dependent upon external factors coming to bear. There was a comment about NVTA's legislation, and which we've noted. And in addition to that, really, NVTA, the authority, has not indicated any intent or desire to change the legislation, and that really is what is going to guide our approach when it comes to legislation, is what the authority members want us to do, and they've not given us any indication that they want to change that. With the scenario planning, again, we've, as I come to in just a moment, we've tried to address the discussion on scenario analysis to be a little bit clearer about some points where we can be clear. On the next couple of slides, we talk about the Planning and Programming Committee, which only met once in the September and October timeframe, but they met kind of in the middle of that timeframe on October 3rd. And they asked us about, can we measure how NVTA is achieving its legislative mandate? Well, in practice, the mandate really for us is to be compliant with the law. The law doesn't tell us that we have to achieve any particular targets or do anything any particular detailed way or achieve any outcomes specifically. So, we focus on being compliant with the law in the way we go about doing the work, which we are. Criticism that's been laid about the plan focusing on roadway. We by and large don't accept that the plan does focus on roadway. The 424 projects cover multiple modes, but there are no funding commitments associated with any of the projects. And indeed, the group of projects that are the most expensive in transaction are actually transit projects overall rather than highway projects. Some of those transit projects are particularly expensive, but nonetheless, the largest amount of dollars within the plan is related to transit projects. Question of where do we want to be in 5 years, the region that is, in terms of how electric vehicle supportive we want to be. All we can really say here is what we've done, which is the funding track record is supportive of advancing decarbonation of transit systems. The extent to which in the future NVTA funds decarbonization of other modes is allowed for in transaction to the extent that we can, which is by including projects that address electrification of other modes. But whether or not we can actually fund those, depends in part on whether people request the funding from us and also whether it's legal for us to do it. So that's still uncertain. As to where the region wants to be, that's more of a policy issue, which transaction does not get into. And similarly, with the next one, we want to get into the overall larger picture, which transaction does. So I think that one's pretty well covered. Continuing with the PPC on the next slide. Again, there are a number of comments made, and I think pretty much without exception, these are all being addressed or have been addressed. The final bullet on here kind of comes to a discussion about the difference between build and no build, but in particular, what projects are included in the no build, because the no build does actually include built projects that do not necessarily exist today. We can provide a list of these in the forthcoming technical report, which is not subject to the review and adoption process of transaction. But we felt that the level of granularity that we'd be getting into if we start providing lists of projects was inconsistent with the general level of granularity in transactions. So we did not include those projects, although we can share those in due course in the technical report. So that's kind of a recap of what we've heard from the committees. If I could just keep going through, there's a few more slides that cover the updates that we've made to the plan and the project list. I would say, these are in close alignment with what was discussed at your last meeting, but just to be a little bit more specific, starting off with some general points, format changes and beautification. I think consultant team's done a good job of making the document, more aesthetically pleasing and certainly a better flow to it. We've added social media links to the back page of the plan for anyone reviewing the document in a digital format. We've kind of looked at clarity and added enhancements where appropriate, consistent with the committee's comments and public comments. On the bottom of page 3 of the document, we've added what we call relevant factors in the development transaction, which we did discuss with you at the last meeting. And these relevant factors are, there's the plan performance is based on 10 approved weighted performance measures. The plan is compliant with the Code of Virginia. The forecasting is based on COG's cooperative forecasts, but the plan is not a land use planning document. And the inclusion of projects in transaction does not represent a funding commitment. However, transaction is an initial eligibility filter for future rounds of our 6-year program. On the next page, we have reduced the number of projects to 424 with the elimination of 3 duplicate projects and the transfer of 2 projects from the build network, or essentially the project list, to the no build network, essentially the baseline, because during the course of transaction, these projects became funded and under construction. So they don't meet the definition of projects for inclusion in the build, but they actually meet the definition of projects to be included in the no build. And essentially they become part of the baseline that we measure everything against. This did necessitate some minor reanalysis, and the analytical results have been updated in the document that you have, or we sent to you a week ago. Elimination of those 5 projects meant the estimated cost of the projects remaining got lower as well, although we still refer to these as approximately 75 billion, because that's kind of where we are with the numbers. I mentioned again the 54% emissions reduction issue, that has been addressed. That 54% bar has been removed from the chart. The number 54%, as I think we mentioned last time, is a good number based on the assumptions occurring, but we accepted the criticism that we didn't want to present the 54% as necessarily locked in without the assumptions. So we reworded that and cleaned that up. We did add a bullet where we discussed mode specific results on page 22 regarding the regional BRT system that's enshrined in transaction and the project list, which from memory accounts for about $10 billion of the cost of the project, of all the projects. So the BRT and high capacity transit projects together account for approximately half of the total increase in transit trips of all the transit projects in transaction, and similarly about a half of all the other impacts or benefits related to the transit only projects in transaction. So that regional BRT system is certainly impactful. On the next page or next slide, looking at the scenario analysis, which is where we deal with uncertainty. That previously had its own sections. It was section 7. We've actually incorporated section 7 into section 6, since it really is a sensitivity test on the main impacts that are covered in section 6. So we wanted to de-emphasize the scenario results in alignment with their intended purpose, and so we've done that by combining them into the impacts section 6. We did include a chart as part of the scenario analysis that related to the build network. We took it out because we considered it was disruptive to the overall flow of the document relative to what we were learning from it. The findings from the scenario analysis of the build network are still mentioned on pages 24 and 25, but we just took that graphic out because we just felt that it wasn't, on balance, it was a net negative to the overall flow of the document. We did instead add a new summary of the scenario results in tabular format on page 24, and consistent with previous discussions, we added reference to scenario results or land use generally on page 25, and including a very brief discussion on what we learned from the land use scenario analysis that we did 5 years ago. We don't believe those results will have changed very much in the intervening 5 years, since the land use forecasts essentially based on the same work or similar work that COG has done. Obviously, removing section 7 meant that section 8 had to be renumbered, and it is now section 7, which is the final section in the document, which includes some key takeaways on page 27, and we've revised those to kind of give them a bit more focus and strength, and kind of begin like the closeout of the document, looking forward to future funding programs based upon the adopted transaction. Just quickly on the project list, as I already mentioned, we removed 3 duplicates, and these bullets here indicate what we did precisely. Essentially, we retained projects ID 64, 441, and 424. In a couple of cases with some minor changes to the project descriptions to reflect the elimination of the duplicate, but none of these changes necessitated any modeling reruns. They're all very minor in nature, so it's really document cleanup. On the next slide, I mentioned the 2 projects that were transferred from the project list or the build network to the baseline, and these are listed here. And then taking out a bunch of projects meant that we had to do some renumbering, and that renumbering had to flow through the project list, and then the kind of the supporting resources online, the interactive map and the sortable project table have been updated to be consistent with that as well. We have also, I would say, kept the archive versions of the plan document and the project list that went to public comment. That is also still retained and clearly marked on our project website. So if anyone ever needs to go back to that, it's still there for people to look at. The final page on the project list, there were some very minor changes regarding project sponsor and project location, which did not necessitate any other changes other than kind of being complete and consistent. So that's the summary of the changes. And then finally, I wanted to mention that in our constant strive for perfection, there are still things that we would like to tweak in the document, very minor things, but things which we believe will help communicate the content of the document to its intended audience. So I don't believe this affects your ability to endorse or recommend approval of the document in just a moment, hopefully. But for transparency, we wanted to be clear what changes we might make to the document subject to any endorsement from the Technical Advisory Committee. Roman numeral page 2 is blank currently. It was intentionally blank, but it does offer us the option to add an NVTA member list and/or group photo. So we might put that onto that page. We want to ensure again that the wording, we use consistent terminology and capitalization, abbreviations, grammar and spelling. There's a few things we've identified. Things like, should plan be capitalized or should it be lowercase? Should bus rapid transit be uppercase B, uppercase R, uppercase T, or lowercase? Those sorts of things. We also want to make sure that we're consistent between the words in the text and any graphics, whether they're titled the same way, exactly the same way, or whether they're not. And any suboptimal wording which doesn't clearly state what we're trying to state and potentially leads to confusion, we want to clean that up. There's probably a couple of sentences where we could do that. From an aesthetic or appearance point of view, the transaction summary document looks really nice, but the project list I think could benefit from a bit more consistency with the plan summary document by the addition of a front and back cover that would be consistent with, but necessarily different in a few places to the transaction plan document. So we wanted to address that. So and we did actually earlier today receive some comments from a planning coordination advisory committee member with some suggested tweaking, wordsmithing of some of the introductory words on the first couple of pages of the transaction project list. Again, from the perspective of a person who's not as into the jargon and the technology and the transportation planning to necessarily know exactly what those words mean, or they're open to misinterpretation. So kind of almost from a layperson perspective, she suggested some changes which we've indicated, are consistent with what I've just described to you on this slide here as being the sorts of changes we would like to make. But nothing that's substantive in any way, shape, or form. No change of the analysis, no addition of new analysis, no changes to the project list, or anything like that. It's really just a strive to better communicate as well as we can what the document is saying. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions, but Chair Boyce, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, sir. So this is the part of the program where it's open for the committee to make any comments or raise questions. Just let's not all speak all at once, but just raise a hand or give me a sign you want to speak. Some people I can't see on the side here, but any comments or questions from the committee?
Hey, this is Michelle Cavucci,
Yes.
and I just wanted to make a comment and thank the efforts of the plan. I thought, I'm somewhat new to this committee, and I personally really appreciated the plan's intentional tie back to the 3 goals: mobility, accessibility, resiliency, and that connection to the core values. And I thought the transparency, it was very well explained in the methodology, the evaluation, it was really helpful. So I just wanted to say I thought it was well received. I understood everything I was reading and appreciated everybody addressing what we had raised previously. And I had no other comments, but that was it. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? I'll jump in. I did note that it is good to note in the plan, because this does come up in conversations and meetings, that delay increases no matter what the scenario is. And there are groups of people that would say that if everybody drove a CAV or if everybody took transit, delay would decrease. One of those is probably coming in the future. The other one of those is highly unlikely to happen just because of the way things are. So delay is going to increase with the population increase, and this plan covers the future aspects of the CAVs and the electric vehicles, the transit enhancements, roadway enhancements, and it covers both the intra and inter-regional transportation. It covers the intra very well, and it also touches on the inter. Even though NVTA is not an inter-regional body, it is addressing those Potomac River crossings that need to be addressed. And also the transit expansion. We mentioned BRT before, but it's also the Metro and the VREs. That is in the plan, and that connects to other regions, which helps not just the Northern Virginia region, it helps all the regions. I noted the increased focus on accessibility, mobility, and resiliency for all with ped, bike, and vehicles. And the BRT is a welcome. It's not an addition in this, but it's a little bit more highlighted than it has in the past. And for those of us who are veterans of this committee, will recall that BRT was brought up early on as a thing that needed to be addressed. And I cite my good friend Robert Fuentes, who brought this up back when he was on the committee back in probably 2009. Good to see that finally come through. I know it's been a developing system, and BRT is a welcome thing. One comment I did notice, we say that there are 424 projects, but if you look at the end of the plan, it goes to 463. That seems to be, if you're not counting on your fingers, something's amiss there. Don't know if that's been obvious. That's an obvious thing that I missed, or I'm sure Mr. Jasper has something to say about it.
Thank you for that, Chair Boyce. Actually, Tom Harrington from the consultant team is on the call, and as is Sri Nampathuri, who's NVTA's project manager, and I could mangle an explanation for you, but I'm going to defer to Tom and to Sri if needed to just explain the numbering system.
Sure. Yeah, we, after some back and forth on how we were going to number the new projects, we've kept the old project numbers the same for projects that were in prior versions of transaction. So any new projects added on this list are added kind of at the end sequentially in terms of the numbering. So, and then projects that you are funded and taking off the project list, we've actually left gaps in the numbering. So if you go back to the project list, you'll start to see some numbers get skipped, and those are projects in prior rounds that actually got funded and pulled off the list. So as a result, yeah, you go beyond 424, but that's because we're trying to keep all the transaction projects numbered sequentially.
Okay. Is that noted somewhere? So some other person who's just looking to pick on this will not have the pickability.
Yeah, we'll take a look and see if we can clarify that a little better. There in the intro of the project list, it notes that the project IDs above 352 are the new additions to the list.
Okay.
But we could put a little note on
that.
there. Yeah.
Yeah, I may have glossed over that.
Yeah. The other thing I would say to that, Chair Boyce, is having unique numbers and not reusing numbers is important in the connection with our 6-year program, because we have for a project to be eligible, the first thing that an applicant needs to say is what the ID number is in transaction. And so projects that have been funded since the document 5 years ago have been using ID numbers, and we don't want to change, we don't want to reuse that ID number for a project that's received funding and is now given to another project. I think that would confuse everybody.
Understood.
So that was another kind of practical reason why we
that's good. I don't know if you need to put that bold and highlight so people like me just don't gloss over it, but yeah, that's a good explanation. I think we're good. So that's the only comments I had. So if no one else had any comments or questions, I put it out for a motion to approve this. Anyone want to make that such a motion?
This is Michelle. I'll make a motion to approve.
Thank you. Second,
Second.
Armand seconds. Any opposed, please speak. Hearing none, unanimous approval of the transaction plan. So when does this go to the board?
the next step is to go to the PPC, the Planning and Programming Committee, on Monday. And after that, depending on a successful endorsement from that committee, then we will be advancing to NVTA for plan adoption at their meeting on December 8th.
Very good.
I would, Ian, if you could, I just want to make sure that the process is good here. If you could just advance a couple of slides. One more. Yeah. So this is the motion that was included in your packet.
Correct. I'm sorry, I didn't read it off as properly as I should have. To clarify, the motion is to approve the recommendation to the authority to adopt the transaction plan and associated project list. Yes.
Thank you.
If anybody wants to change their vote, so say so now. Hearing none, we're good. So we're up to NVTA updates, Ms. Backman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Number one, I wanted to thank everyone as we are on the tail end of this transaction update. As you all are aware, we update transaction every 5 years, but it's really more along the lines of a every 2.5 year process. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I know a lot of you, except Frank, are coming in after work to put in your time. But Frank, we appreciate you as well. But thank you. You are very much appreciated. Regarding the NVT updates, the only thing that I have is we are working on our 2023 legislative program, which looks an awful lot like the 2022 legislative program. Our priority is to protect the dedicated revenue streams and powers of the NVTA, restore that annual long-term funding. The balance right now, the outstanding balance is 38.5 million, and that was a part of the diversion of 102 million to Metro for their state of good repair needs. Protect Virginia's dedicated transportation funding. We felt it was a need to include that language and then support the use of effective transportation technology. The thing that we removed was supporting committees to meet virtually, because we are meeting virtually. That did pass through the Virginia General Assembly. So the other elements are a carryover from the 2022 legislative program.
With the election, did the chance of getting the Metro funding back to us change a bit, or did it get better, get worse, did it not change?
You know, it's hard to say because there was a lot of talk in the previous session about this surplus. Now, the Commonwealth does have a surplus, but it's not a dedicated ongoing surplus. What you're looking at is the combination of the IIJA funds and then the stimulus monies that the Commonwealth, as well as other areas across the country, received. So that did put us at a surplus, but that is not long-term sustainable. So to answer your question, Randy, I do not know. We are trying to get it back. We are also acutely aware with every passing year, it makes it a little more harder, a little more difficult to get it back as well. But we want to make sure that it stays top of mind regarding our ability to advance projects. So that's a long way of saying, I don't know.
Accurate, thank you. Given that is the end of the agenda, open it again to the committee if there was any questions or comments on, it's an open discussion night right now. And if we just want to get on with our lives and get to bed, that's an option too. So, any motion to adjourn? We can go that way. Everybody jump at that.
Motion to adjourn.
There we go. Seconds.
Second.
Everybody says second. All right, there we go. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank
Have a
you.
good